I'm a huge fan of the Motor Trend roadkill guys, right? I just love the idea of those of getting some old junky car and giving it some new life and building some outrageous projects. But for those guys, every time they need some real talent behind the wheel, then they call you, right? And then here you are driving their junky cars around laps or doing whatever to get times in. So it turns out that's a tiny part of what you do. You go to all the races. You've done a bunch of stuff. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this and how long you've been doing it for?
Well, I stumbled on an ad in a shopping newspaper in 1977,
Oh wow!
and it said, "Race your own car, $5." Well, I'd always loved going around corners, and I had a really cool car. I had a Datsun 510 two-door, and I bought it because I liked the wheels. It was lowered, and back in my high school, nobody was lowering cars; they were jacking them up,
Ah,
putting 50 series fat tires on the back. But I was always a sporty car guy, and that ad was for an autocross. So that was my introduction to legal competition. Autocross, and that's racing in a parking lot around a small course set up with pylons and traffic cones. It's like slalom skiing with your car. And
okay.
I loved it. I was pretty good at it. And that led to I went to college, I got a degree in accounting, blah, blah. But my first real job was putting on an autocross. It was a Dodge program to do an autocross at college campuses. I saved all my money for about 2 years, bought a little race car for a little road racing series, Volkswagen Cup, and I was on my way. And I just stayed at it. I had a side career to actually make a little money. I was doing sales training for manufacturers. That got me a lot of good introductions, and we would set up little autocrosses for the salespeople to try out the latest model. And they were usually high performance because they were driving events, BMWs, etc. And my career was building. I finally got some factory rides, and that was the high point of my career as I drove for the factory, Porsche, Audi, Mazda, Volvo, and then Mazda again, all the way up well into my 50s.
Wow.
And won, almost 100 pro races, 10 championships. And so I got around. In the meantime, I always did little special side projects. And as my racing slowed down, I got involved with Motor Trend magazine. I became their track tester, writer, video host. It has been fantastic. It's just been great. I've set a lot of lap records through Motor Trend, usually in brand new, whatever it is, fantastic cars.
Yeah, and that's how a lot of us know you because yeah, that's gives you a lot of exposure when you're on TV on shows, right? Because they have a ton of content they're creating digitally now. It used to be on YouTube, but now they have their own channel, right?
Yes,
Is that what
the
it is?
Motor Trend on demand.
Motor Trend on Demand. There you
Sign
go.
up and see every single show ever made. The roadkill
Yeah.
guys are there. Mike
Yes.
Finnegan has got his own show now, Faster with Finnegan. I've been on that show a couple of times with a
Yeah.
very scary V8 powered Chevy S10 pickup.
Oh yes.
And we make it better and better, and he does, and it's a good time.
Yeah,
Motor
Freiberger always goes for the junky cars, and then he Finnegan goes for the high performance, almost right. Like that's how that
Yeah,
works.
well, he started with an S10 he found on Craigslist.
Yes, those are shows are very very entertaining. For some reason, we just love people being creative when it comes to using old cars, and I love old classic cars, right? And like them, there's so many of us that do
I'm
that,
the same
and
way.
yeah, and so I mean, you always see a performance, but we're appreciating performance, right? Like my background, I wasn't a car guy, but I wanted to have an electric car, something that was new and innovative or whatever. But back in the day when I wanted one, Tesla wasn't around, and so there was no electric cars. The only way to do one was to make my own, and so I went that route and I went down that rabbit hole. And here we are, almost 10 years later. I'm doing this, several of these cars, and I want to build a fleet, the whole thing, right? But now I'm talking to people that are, kind of interested in the same thing. Now electrics have become real. Like that
Yes.
going down the street in my neighborhood, I'm not the only crazy one with a Tesla or with the electric. There's like all my neighbors have them. You're like, what? This is
Right.
crazy. Like, how do we get here? So
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see someone like you behind an electric, right? Because you recently just did a race. When you talked a little bit about that race behind an electric car.
Well, in my work with Motor Trend, I first got introduced to Tesla. We had a Model S, and the technical director, Kim Reynolds, was driving it around years ago when they were new.
When they were new.
And he came out to one of our track days in this Tesla, and I knew very little about it. For me, electric cars had always been weird, right?
Yeah.
They were on the fringes, and
Yeah.
even if they worked, they were really strange. They usually look like some sort of eggy thing, or
Yes.
well, the Tesla rolls up, and I look at a Model S, and I think, well, that's a nice looking car. And I went over and I got in it, and I mean, just that first impression of opening the door and getting in, like you just said, this car was real. This wasn't strange. And I just took it for a little ride around the parking lot out of curiosity. And I was so impressed immediately with just driving it up and down, how smooth and quiet, and the quality of the car, and the forward think of the big screen, information screen in the center of the dash, and so impressed. So eventually, well, I got to track one, and it handled great. But guess what? You couldn't run a Model S flat out for very long at all. It would cut down its power, I think, because it was overheating.
Overheating. Yeah.
As you probably know, when you flow a lot of electrons, you generate a lot of heat.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so then the Model 3 came out a couple of years later, and we were going to track test that. And it did not have as much of an overheating issue on track. You could go, but it had other issues. The stability control was incredibly intervened a lot, and
It was
the
aggressive.
brakes were not happy at track speeds. So then Tesla started working on a track mode. Being this small company, they can react so quickly. And so I had actually told them when I tested it, the car was so downright scary in a racing situation, mind you. They weren't built for that. They were built for street driving. And now I'm going flat out at Willow Springs over some big bumps. The brakes just flat did not work and sent me across the desert at 80 miles an hour. And thank goodness there was no walls, no big rocks. I went all the way across the infield of the track and rejoined on the other side and got out and said, I'm done. This car, I mean, that could have been bad. But guess what? The Tesla people called me just a month or so later and asked me to come help them set up track mode version 1.
Okay.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and they had done a lot of work. The car was already much better in a track environment. The brakes worked far better. The handling, they allowed the car to go fast through a corner without the stability control coming in and just clamping it down. And it was fascinating to work with these guys. The chief guy was Lars, and I can't remember his last name. And then there was a young engineer there. And as far as I know, that was the chassis department, those two guys.
Wow.
And we would go out in the car, and the young engineer would be riding with me with a laptop. And I said, well, we're gonna rip around the corners. He goes, I got this, don't you worry. And sure enough, he did. He could hang on to that laptop with his legs. And I'd be talking to him about how the car was handling, and he would be adjusting on the computer, typing while we're driving around the track.
Wow. Okay.
It was like an episode from an early Fast and Furious movie.